Welcome to the Commercial Property Podcast. My name is Suzi Carter. I am a chartered surveyor. I've been involved in commercial property in the UK for 30 years and I've done hundreds of commercial property deals. I'm here to be your guide through the commercial property market, whether you're an experienced investor or whether you're literally thinking about dipping your toe in the world of commercial real estate. I will be here talking to you about all kinds of things commercial real estate in the UK, and I've also got some fantastic guest experts who are joining me. So please do subscribe if you'd like to follow, and if you'd like any more help or information on commercial real estate, please do click www.suzicarter.com, which is my website, and you can find out all the ways I can help you. So stay tuned for this week's episode. Welcome back. So today I'm going to be talking about choosing your tenants for your commercial portfolio. And it's more important than it ever has been to make sure that you choose well, because the rate of change happening in the world, the rate of change happening with technology, socioeconomic changes, there's so much going on that can affect your tenants. And ultimately, commercial property tenants are businesses. So anything that will affect businesses or types of business will ultimately affect your property. And, you know, the number one fundamental rule that is that you need to have enough demand for your property. And what we need to look for now in terms of future-proofing our portfolios is making sure that that demand will lead into the future. I think that, especially if you've been a residential investor, you know, that there's always going to be a tenant for a house. There's always going to be somebody, a homeowner probably, who will want to buy it, depending on what type of property it is. But if you've got a commercial property, then trends can change the desirability of different types of real estate. And so therefore, we need to understand the future-proof and the future viability of that property. So I'm going to give you some hints today and some tips as to how you can do that. But I think the thing I must leave you with to begin with really is that if demand is thin now for a unit, is that going to improve into the future? So I speak to a lot of clients who are looking perhaps, say, at retail, and, you know, there's lots of vacant units around them. Maybe they're buying in a more secondary part of town. And the thing that I kind of open with really is this going to improve? You know, is there something happening locally where this is going to improve? Now, sometimes there is, genuinely, sometimes there's going to be regeneration or new businesses coming in or something happening that really is changing the nature and feel of a location. But very often, you know, there's early warning signs that there's problems there. And, you know, because a commercial property is only worth as much as the rent that's being received on it, the tenant, the lease, then, you know, it's crucially important that you understand the supply and demand of the dynamics locally. So let's talk about tenants. So in terms of choosing a tenant, then you want to have the freedom of choice. And I've seen this in managing shopping centre portfolios at a corporate level. You know, I used to manage some of the nation's biggest and best shopping centres, but I also have managed some of the more secondary, polite way of putting it, more secondary type of shopping centres. And I've seen the difference. I've seen where the more secondary, the more tertiary shopping centres where you're really struggling and basically beggars can't be choosers. So, you know, you've got tenants playing you off against maybe another shopping centre owner. You've got turnover rents having to be negotiated because there's not enough tenant demand for you to get any tension to negotiate properly. Break clauses, you know, every 6 months. You know, you don't want to be in that situation. You want to be in a situation where you can say to a tenant, okay, there's 2 or 3 of you interested in this property, and therefore, you know, we're going to negotiate a higher rent, better lease terms, etc. So, and I'll tell you kind of how you can do that. But first of all, let's look at tenants. Let's look at the types of tenant that maybe will struggle more if AI starts to grow. And, you know, I don't think it's an if now with AI. if we're talking to more techie people than me, this technology is multiplying at a rate of knots. It's going to be a year to 2 years before we really start seeing the impact on the job market. And I was reading an article recently about how there's positive news because AI doesn't seem to be destroying jobs. I think that's just because organizations aren't using it enough now. There obviously is a tipping point with technology where it starts to be used. But the types of tenant, that I think that will really struggle with maintaining a presence, with maintaining a competitive advantage. First of all, discretionary retail. Discretionary retail is basically where you want to have something rather than need it. If there's a choice, you don't have to buy it. So discretionary retail is the first to suffer during downturns, and therefore, if there's if there is a downturn, people will spend the pound of their pocket on food or maybe even leisure than they will on clothing or whatever else it might be. So that pound, you're basically competing for the pound in the pocket. So discretionary retail will struggle. Now, doesn't mean every location that's going to suffer. So this is where some of the nuances are, because if you're in a big city and you've got, your whole portfolio is made of discretionary retail, like a clothes shop, for example, clothing shops, that may not work. But if you've got a really highly niche location where maybe there's tourist traffic, where there's some really high socioeconomics, really short high streets, niche type discretionary retail, like little boutiques, actually might be thriving. So this is where the nuance is with commercial property. This is why it's very difficult to generalize, because, where one might succeed, then another may not. And in one location, it may work, in another location it may not. So you've also got other uses like banks. There's banks are closing at a rate of knots, and they can be a great opportunity because they can be repurposed. And we're seeing the rise of banking hubs. So the post office link kind of led banking hubs where groups of banks are kind of clubbing together. Maybe Barclays is one day, NatWest the next, Lloyds the next, and so they're kind of sharing the facility. It's mainly for small businesses, but also for consumers as well. Things like travel agents, we've seen a lot of travel agency closing because you can book online, but the travel agents who are surviving are more niche type travel agents and also catering maybe for an elderly population. So again, winners and losers, different locations, it may work, in others it may not. Things like press, like printing, like a lot of printing companies used to be located, photocopying companies used to be located near offices. There's nigh on no use for those anymore. And administrative jobs where they can be automated. So what's interesting about kind of offices is that where there's nuanced and information or advice that needs a human touch, where there's different options and a machine couldn't do that, then there's very much going to be a need for those kind of professional services. But where there's kind of automated tasks, then there's perhaps not going to be as much of a need. So, again, a bit of a yin and yang. So the type of industries that I can see, or operators that I can see thriving in a new world, which, let's face it, isn't far away, are things like professional services where there's problem solving, like I said, where the human touch is needed, where there's nuance, where there's advice, where it just, at the moment, at least, it can't be automated. So, I can definitely still see a place for lawyers and accountants, maybe not on the administrative level, but certainly in terms of the more nuanced advice. So problem solving, like super, super important. Community, I think increasingly as we get into a more technological age, I do think that community is going to be increasingly important, and where operators can form their own communities as well. So, for example, health and fitness really struggled during the pandemic. Obviously, it closed, but and there was a lot of fallout afterwards. But those health and fitness organisations that retain the personal touch, that formed a sense of community around their facility, really have thrived since then. So community is super important, and the same goes for kind of community shops. I can see like some small market town, suburban locations are actually going to do a lot better than city centres, because there's more capacity for them to build a community, and therefore more reason for the customers to kind of to shop or to visit those kind of businesses. Also, adaptability. I think an open mindset from businesses in terms of using technology. So, for example, I know a number of lawyers who are actually created like an AI bot who replicates a lawyer, and they're actually using that really successfully. But at the kind of more expensive price points is where they're concentrating their time, because that's where the kind of really important information is relayed. So this kind of adaptability of service and kind of using technology, but also not replacing it too. Also, essential services like car maintenance, like dentists, like, I mean, health, definitely, apart from the kind of booking of health, then definitely kind of health. Also personal care, like barbers, hairdressers, beauty salons, etc. So anything where there's a service you're being offered that you just can't automate or get online, then I do think that that's going to be relatively successful. And like I said earlier, I think that niche locations will work. So, I mean, this is relevant now as relevant now as it will be in 2 to 5 years' time. You know, niche locations where perhaps they buck some of the trends. So where an operator may not work well in a big city or in a shopping centre or in a big office, actually will work really well in a niche location where there's a different type of customer, where there's a different type of business being located. And, you know, I think that those kind of locations is where differentiation really works. So, you know, the kind of more one-man band, one-woman band type operator, not the identikit, would work really, really well. And also niche locations that are near to housing, because ultimately with you know, if there's a small business wants to work near home, then, you know, some nice boutique differentiated type offices might work really well, rather than kind of city centre offices that maybe don't work quite so well. And also experiences, you know, we kind of want an excuse or a reason to get off our couches now, because there's no other reason to do it other than have experiences. You know, we can shop online, we can play games online, we can watch movies online or in the comfort of our own home. But we're social creatures at heart. And so anything where we can get experiences, interact. This is why shopping centres are pivoting towards, you know, a high proportion of food and beverage and leisure. This is why they have events programs, because it's luring people out. It's luring people to come and shop. So, you know, summary kind of healthcare, professional services, maintenance and repair will still be needed. Food and beverage, but food and beverage where maybe it's a local baker's or a butcher's or a greengrocer's, where you can touch and feel quality produce rather than kind of just buying online. Personal care and childcare and education, you know, you can really see that can't be replicated. You can't, you know, I don't think we're quite at the world of online nannies yet. So nurseries and schooling, clubs, etc., you know, can work really, really well. So I think kind of the world we're moving into is all about being discerning tenant choice. And if you want to future-proof your portfolio, there's some things that you can do. So the first thing is, you know, take a look at your portfolio and see whether you have a lot of single lets in it. Because if you've got a lot of single lets, let's look at the tenant type of those single lets. And if they don't tick some of these boxes we've talked about today, then perhaps your portfolio A is too reliant on single tenants, which obviously if they go down will render your property totally vacant. And number two, are not in future-proof sectors and actually could struggle going forwards. And, you know, they're red flags. They may either be pivoting tenant mix, trying to subdivide or multi-let space or bring more multi-lets into your portfolio, because with multi-lets, you're diversifying tenant risk. There's lots of different types of operators, and, commercial finance really likes multi-lets for exactly that reason, because if one or two tenants fails, it's usually not terminal for the investment. There's usually other tenants that can pick up the mortgage and pick up the rent. So, definitely looking at that portfolio and just working out where your risk is. And, if there's tenant risk, then looking at ways to try and mitigate that. Either through multi-lets or selling or changing tenant mix or buying a different type of property. We also need to look at trends. So look at what kinds of property tick the trends. And, it's really easy to buy super cheap property, but just make sure that you're buying property that's going to be future proofed. So, you can still buy pretty good, well-priced properties. So, for example, industrial that you could split up into several units, in certain locations that some of my clients are buying in, you could buy that for somewhere between 200 and 300,000 pounds. So you're not kind of breaking the bank on it, but, and you can actually double the values by increasing the rents and by kind of asset managing, by multi-letting. And a lot of those operators, they are maintenance or workshop type operators that, as long as you kind of do checks and balances on them, potentially may still have demand going forward. So, really interesting in terms of kind of choosing your tenant type. And then, make sure that you're buying properties where you have a choice.
This episode is brought to you by Bond Finance Limited, your trusted partner for commercial property mortgage solutions. Are you an experienced residential property investor about to diversify into commercial property, looking for funding options? Bond Finance can help. Whether you're planning to expand, refinance, or make a major property investment, Bond Finance provides expert advice with access to a wide range of lenders, from high street to specialist. Book a free discovery session today to explore how we can tailor commercial funding solutions to your unique investment strategy. Visit www.bondfinanceltd.co.uk and take the next step in your commercial finance journey.
As a landlord, a choice is king. And as I say, I've seen that firsthand, where we've had huge vacancies in shopping centres or on high streets, or in offices for that matter, where, you are literally having to accept very penal terms from tenants, because basically the balance of power is in their favour. They can see that you've got loads of space to let, loads of supply and not much demand, and therefore they can name their terms. And of course, that's really what happened post-COVID, was that, the brands were renegotiating their leases right, left and centre. And isn't it interesting that it was the brands that didn't pay during COVID, where it was the one man, the one woman bands that did. So it's not always the best thing to have brands in your property. Far from it. The one man bands that had personal guarantees tended to be the ones that actually paid, which is super interesting. So, property comes with a number of risks. Every investment comes with a number of risks. And one of the risks that we're looking at the moment is market risk, which leads to tenant risk. And, it's important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, but equally, before you've even bought your first property, you can actually shape the direction of travel of your portfolio. And that is why I advocate niching your commercial property strategies so much. Niching is absolutely key, because what it means is you've done the strategic thinking to begin with. You've worked out where you want to invest, and you've examined the trends. You've looked at the future potential of that investing location. If you're scattergun investing, the problem with that is that you're being deal led. You're having to find out the tenant demand in every deal. You're having to work out the rents, the leases, etc. And you can't be guaranteed that actually where you're investing is actually future proof, that the demand is future proofed. Whereas actually, if you become trend led or location led, and you really understand the nuts and bolts of how that location works. You've done all your investigation. You've spoken to commercial agents who can really be your friend in terms of where the demand is, whether that type of property is popular, whether it's not. You understand what's happening in that town. Are there any loads of new developments being consented, or is basically all the development that's happening housing, which can be really good news for commercial. Are there new businesses moving into that location? Is there new investment moving in? If you take, for example, the Oxford to Cambridge corridor in the UK, the government's putting loads of infrastructure investment in there. It's got the two big universities there, Oxford and Cambridge. So they're trying to concentrate life science investment around there. They're even talking about relaxing planning conditions in that area to make sure that more and more investment goes into that area. You're pushing against the tide with that. And if you've got, for example, businesses that are offshoots of life science type businesses, and that's something that is being invested in heavily, that is future-proofed in terms of trends, you're onto a good thing. Equally, you can find a really nice niche location where there's a really short high street, but you can get nice long leases. It's got loads of tourist trade, really high socioeconomics, and therefore, little one-man band type brands can really do well. They can thrive because they're getting the footfall. There's the people who visit there have got a lot of money in their pocket and are willing to spend it on maybe even discretionary spend. So it's very difficult to generalize. One of the really most dangerous things with commercial is to generalize. But actually, there are certain trends, there's certain direction of travel that we need to think about. And this is just really important. And I would urge you to, rather than kind of finding yourself later thinking, gosh, I wish I'd niched, or I wish I chose a different type of tenant profile, is just to really pause before you do lettings, pause before you buy a property, and just think about the future potential of what you are buying. A lot of deals will still work, will still be fine, but you've gone through that process and you've thought about it. And, the absolute kind of golden rule is to have multiple exits on everything that you're buying. So, make sure that you have flexibility. You're able to subdivide the unit up if you can. You can repurpose the uppers, and you can maybe ultimately convert to a completely different use, maybe retail or other commercial uses, if tenant demand falls away. That's the ultimate way of protecting the downside on a property. So I hope this has been useful. It's certainly not intended to scare anybody, far from it. In fact, it's actually really exciting because there's going to be so many opportunities that are going to open up as a result of this. Repurposing opportunities, different types of tenant coming into the market. We just need to make sure we're thinking about it. That's